What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I'm going to give you the top 5 tips that I have for brewing your best West Coast IPA in the modern era. Back in the day, West Coast IPAs were like super malty, they had tons of crystal malts in them, and they were super bitter. The IBU wars were taking place, and breweries were trying to stuff as many IBUs as possible into these beers, trying to get the most bitter IPA they could. That has all changed significantly. The West Coast IPA of today is nothing like the West Coast IPA of yesterday. Ever since the hazy IPA or the New England IPA showed up on scene, people's approaches to what they want out of hop flavor has changed significantly, and hop growers have selected for more fruity, tropical, expressive flavor hops as opposed to bitterness. Nowadays, the modern West Coast IPA still retains its identity as a clear IPA and as a bitter beer, but it's nowhere close to the bitterness bombs and the caramel malt heavy IPAs of the past. So today, I'm going to talk to you about how to make your best version of that in 2024 and beyond. If anything nowadays, West Coast IPAs are defined by being crisp and dry and refreshing, while still being absolutely loaded with hop flavor and a firm assertive bitterness. So let's talk about that in more detail, starting with the water profile. One of the biggest levers you can pull in making a good IPA is messing with that sulfate to chloride ratio. In my previous video in the series on hazy IPAs, I explained to you why a 2-to-1 chloride to sulfate ratio is important for making the hops feel juicier and just dampening down that bitterness in the hazy IPA. For the West Coast IPA, we actually want to flip that around completely, and instead of 2-to-1 chloride to sulfate, we want 2-to-1 sulfate to chloride. And what this is going to do is it's going to express the hops very differently. It's going to make them brighten up and pop out in their flavor. It's also going to increase the perception of their bitterness, which is important for this type of beer style. Granted, it's not going to be the bitterness bombs of the past. We are done with that now, but it still has a firm, assertive bitterness to it that is balanced and refreshing. So adding in a little bit of gypsum and Epsom salts will help tremendously in boosting that sulfate content to get you that little bit of brightness there. And also, because these beers typically finish clear, one of the best things you can do in the water profile to help you get that clarity is to increase the calcium content as well. Bringing it up to about 50 parts per million is a good starting point to get that extra bit of yeast to drop out. Calcium salts added to the mash can also make the beer a little bit more acidic, which is important for a few reasons. Firstly, you don't have any dark malts in these beers, so you're not going to be relying on malts themselves to bring the mash pH under control. So typically people will be adding some sort of acid to the mash to balance the mash pH. But you can also get a decent way there just by adding enough calcium salts, specifically gypsum. But the pH thing is not complete with the water profile alone. Just like hazy IPAs, West Coast IPAs can be heavily dry hopped as well. And if you're gonna go down that route, I do recommend dropping that wort pH a little bit, down to about 5.0 or so, before you pitch your yeast if you're intending to heavily dry hop. Dry hopping raises the pH of the beer quite a bit. Standard wort pH going into the fermenter is usually around like 5.2 or so, a little bit more acidic than the mash typically. When you add the dry hops, it can raise the pH to a point where the flavors of the final beer are actually quite a bit out of whack. So if you drop your pH a little bit in the wort prior to adding your dry hops, which then raises it back up, your final beer pH ends up at the right point. All right, so now for tip number 2. In modern West Coast IPA brewing, caramel malts are absolutely no good. I honestly do recommend just getting rid of them entirely. The reason for this is twofold. Firstly, they can be cloyingly sweet when used in excess, and that really can compete a lot with the hop flavor and make for not so tasty of a beer at the end of the process. But secondly, caramel malts can actually accelerate the staling of the beer. They can act as an agent to increase oxidation, and that can be a big problem for an IPA. If you want some sort of extra malt character in your West Coast IPA, which is perfectly fine, I would recommend sticking with Vienna malts, Munich malts, or any other standard toasted kind of malt, not a caramel malt. Now, what if you still want a darker colored West Coast IPA, one that's red or even brown? Without using caramel malts, well, I'd recommend tossing in just a pinch, maybe an ounce at most, of something like chocolate malt or midnight wheat at the very most extreme levels. That will get you very nice red colors, or even darker, without adding any real flavor to the beer. This is what's used in amber ales and Irish red ales all the time to get that perfect red color. With levels that small, you really shouldn't be getting any roasted flavors out of this anyway. But if you do, chances are the hops will completely blow those flavors out anyway. Tip number 3 is get your beer to finish dry. It doesn't need to be excessively dry like a saison, but it really should be a lot drier than your standard beer. I really would recommend you getting below 1010 as a final gravity. This is gonna do a few things. It's gonna make the beer heavily drinkable, crushable, if you will. It's also going to ensure that it's refreshing. It's going to make it snappy and satisfying, and it's going to increase that perception of crispness, especially with the sulfate to chloride ratio being 2:1 if you've already done something like that. These are not hazy IPAs. They're not meant to be juicy. You could still get plenty of good hop flavor out of them, and we'll talk about that in a second, but the final gravity of that beer, that dryness, is such an important aspect of these beers. So a couple ways to get yourself down to that low final gravity reliably and consistently. Firstly, mashing at a lower temperature. About 148 degrees Fahrenheit, about 65 degrees Celsius is the sweet spot for this kind of attenuation. Secondly, would be adding in a highly fermentable adjunct, something like flaked rice, flaked corn, or sugar. The final piece of the puzzle is using the right kind of yeast. A high attenuating ale yeast that's still clean, like Chico, is the obvious choice here because it's just the classic strain. But you can also use other strains of ale yeast that are quite clean and can ferment all the way down. A fantastic option is Lutrikavike, in fact. Lutrikavike will not only attenuate the crap out of the beer, make it super clean in the process, and be fermented at high temperatures in a short period of time, but it will also slightly drop the pH of the fermentation, meaning you won't need to pre-acidify your wort either. It's really actually one of the best yeast for this type of style. You can also use a really nice, clean, high attenuating lager yeast. This is the whole concept of the cold IPA, which in my opinion is really more of a subset of the West Coast IPA style. 3470 will get you super clean flavor and high attenuation. But if you want a little extra maltiness, you can use something like S23 as well. Another good, clean, high attenuating lager yeast that has a little bit more residual malt flavor behind it. And now we'll talk about hops. Arguably, this is the core of the beer. It's the most important aspect of it. Just like hazy IPA, just like New England IPA, you're gonna want to really focus heavily on grouping flavor profiles of similar types, looking into the oils and the terpene contents of these hops, matching them up appropriately, and trying to select for either tropical or citrus or pine or whatever makes the most sense for you and what you envision this beer to be like. In the past, old school American hops that are super high in cohumulone, that were like super bitter, piney, resinous, that was what people thought of when they thought of West Coast IPAs. Nowadays, we have all of these new world hops that are selected for tropical character, fruitiness, and many other attributes that are highly desirable for hop flavor. These really should be what you're actually focusing on now for hop character in West Coast IPAs, especially the modern ones, because you can still squeeze tons of that character out, even with a little bitterness beforehand. And let's talk about that bitterness. The key word here is a firm bitterness, not an excessive one. So we're talking about 40 to 50 IBUs overall. I mean, IBUs are not really a useful system of measurement anymore. I think we've beaten that topic to death in the homebrew community. But the point is, it's a good recipe building tool. So if you're trying to get a general idea of how bitter your beer is going to be, it still works for that concept. But don't rely on it as an actual unit of measurement. But the point is here, this is 40 to 50 IBUs, not 70 to 100 IBUs like West Coast IPAs used to be like. Now we're looking at more of a restrained bitterness that's still noticeable and firm, but is more of a balancing character to the beer, as opposed to a punch you in the face and then keep beating you into the concrete kind of bitterness. Just like hazy IPAs, just like New England IPAs, you're gonna wanna lean heavily into that late kettle addition. Maybe a little bit more so for these beers than for hazy IPAs. Definitely use a large whirlpool addition with several ounces of hops, and definitely lean hard into a dry hop as well. I encourage that short, quick dry hop, just like I mentioned for the hazy IPA video on this series. This will help you avoid hop creep and diacetyl production from that, and it will help you avoid like that grassy off flavor from having too much vegetal material. Lean heavily also into flowable hop products that don't have that vegetal material. Use ALDC enzyme in the dry hop to prevent the diacetyl production from hop creep. Doing all that in combination, just like you would for a hazy IPA, is gonna net you a fantastic result for your West Coast IPA. The last tip I have for you is the appearance and conditioning of these beers. Nowadays, West Coast IPAs are meant to be clean and crisp, and half of your perception of clean and crisp actually occurs when you're staring at the beer in your glass. Let's do a little thought experiment here. Say you order 2 different West Coast IPAs and they both come out at the same time. In the first glass is hazy and opaque, but still smells like a West Coast IPA. The second glass comes out super clear, bright, and there's no haze in it whatsoever. Smells the same as the first beer though. Before you even take a sip of either of these 2 beers, are you mentally expecting a difference in clean and crisp character between the 2 of them? You probably are, and the reason why is because you drink with your eyes. Clarity is really important when it comes to serving these beers for, I believe, that reason. It's not just because it looks nice, I think it really is half of the presentation of the beer and what you're setting yourself up to taste before you even take that first sip. And sometimes it's fun to kind of mess with people and, get that clean and crisp character even with a little haze in there. And it's okay to have a little haze in this style. I'm not saying don't have any haze in it. That's actually kind of difficult, especially with high polyphenol hops. So what I'm saying is just use a little effort to try and get the beer to clear up somewhat. A little whirlflock in the boil, doing a full boil to break down those starches and proteins and make sure that the beer can separate them out, a good cold break. And don't be afraid to use clarifying agents like gelatin, Clarity Firm, or Biofine. Those are perfectly fine to use as long as you're not introducing any oxygen when you add them to the beer. Just like hazy IPAs, West Coast IPAs are sensitive to oxygen, just a little bit less so than hazy IPAs. Anyway guys, that's my top 5 tips on brewing your best West Coast IPAs. If you're watching this video and you've got a lot of experience with brewing West Coast IPAs and there's something I didn't cover in this particular video, please drop that in the comment section down below so everyone watching the video can learn from it as well. There's always a lot more than just 5 tips out there for brewing good beers, right? So let's all educate each other and make the community a little bit smarter by jumping in the comments section. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and of course comment down below. If you want to help support the channel, please consider picking up a t-shirt like this design. I have this one and plenty of others in my merchandise store, which is linked down in the description box below. I also have a Patreon, and my patrons are the reason why I'm still able to continue this channel and keep doing what I'm doing just, week over week. It's been really difficult to keep up with things lately, but the patrons are making it worth it, and I really do appreciate your support. I also have channel memberships, and there's the super thanks button if you want to contribute in those ways without the Patreon. That's totally fine as well, and all goes right back into the channel. I also have an Amazon store where you can find not only the channel's production equipment, but also a lot of the home brewing equipment that I recommend that's available on Amazon. That's all great stuff, and it's on that store. If you want to follow me on more than just YouTube, I'm also active on Instagram and Facebook as The Apartment Brewer, so please also check those links out for some more frequent content so you could see what is going to come to the channel in the future. Anyway guys, thank you for watching all the way to the end of the video. It means a lot to me, and I will catch you all in the next one. So until then, cheers.